most, I know almost everybody here, but I'm going to tell you anyway. My name is Bob Del Sandro, Director of Bass Harbor Library. And we're celebrating Ruth Moore again this year, as we do every year. And tonight we have Ella Kotzen with us. And as usual, what I usually do when I start any program here, I usually read a poem. And tonight I'm going to read a poem by Andrea Gibson, who's a poet who just passed. But I thought this applied both to Andrea Gibson, but also to Ruth Moore. This is called When a Poet Dies. When a poet dies, a poet who was the sun, bright and warm, searing truth, hopeful rays, we whose ears were blessed, whose souls were healed, whose hearts were held by their words, we flicker in the darkness with the stars they planted in our breath, we constellations of memories, shining tears of gratitude, pulling us closer to each other in honor and in grief and love. Rest well, dear poet, we carry your light. I read that tonight because every year we celebrate Ruth Moore, and truth be told, when I first started here, I had seen Ruth Moore stickers for probably about 15 years because we used to see them on Vinyl Haven all the time where we lived. But I never read Ruth Moore until I came here. And my first reading of Ruth Moore was From Cold as a Dog. And so I read this book and I loved it, so now I can wear the button proudly and say I read Ruth Moore and not feel like I'm a liar. But I know there are much more learned people and, of course, family members who know Ruth Moore. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ella Kotzen.
Thank you. All right, I have handouts that I'm sure some of you have gotten, but I'm going to pass them out. So I have a copy of the ballad I'm going to be talking about tonight, and then I also have some discussion questions. I only printed 15. I tried to think, what would Ruth do? She wouldn't want too many trees dead. So I think we should be good, but maybe share with your neighbor. Or actually, I'll just have everyone take one,
Ella,
pass
can
it
you
down.
move your whatever that's called,
Podium.
podium a little to inside, because otherwise I can't see. Ah, there. Hi, how are you? Thank you. Good to see you. You? You well?
I'm here. That's the best thing.
Alright, I'm hoping enough copies get around. So we have one copy of the ballad,
I think so, 'cause
and I have two books too I can pass around instead of.
Somebody needs this. I have my own.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I'm gonna have, yeah.
We have.
I have
Oh, you do?
We
Oh,
have.
Amanda?
I have two,
Oh,
actually.
okay. I accidentally have two questionnaires. Anyone need questions?
I have a question for you. Did everyone get it?
You have it.
Okay, yeah.
All right. Okay, so just talk about what I'm going to be doing tonight. I know some of you all have been to lectures and talks I've given. Today I was thinking about making it a little bit different. So it's going to be a 3-part presentation. So to start, we're going to read the ballad out loud because the ballad is meant to be read out loud. And particularly, I have my New Jersey accent, but I'm really interested in hearing everyone's, dialects and accents. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a stanza and then I'm going to pass it on to the next person. And we're going to get through the ballad once and maybe twice if we decide to go again. So the second thing we're going to do is I'm going to just give a lecture for about 25 minutes on some of the work I did. Just making sure that everyone has a copy.
Do you mind saying who you are?
Yeah, I was just about to say. So my name is Ella Kotzen. I'm a PhD student at Boston University in the American Studies Department. I'm a board member at the Tremont Historical Society, I've been coming here for 5 summers now. I'm a big Ruth Moore fan. I've read all the books that I've gotten my hands on. I think I'm just missing about 2. And that's why I'm here tonight. So that's what we're going to do for the second part. So I'm going to give a lecture on this ballad. I studied this ballad this past semester. But instead of reading from the 40 pages that I wrote, I'm just going to read from the 12 pages. And then lastly, I have discussion questions because ultimately, I've done my literary analysis, but this is about the lives of many in this room. Literally, because we have some family members, but also just people who have grown up here on the island or who visited here in the summers. So I wanted to make sure that I was centering your guys' voices as well. And so that will be the third part where we have a discussion. I'm imagining it'll go for about 15 to 20 minutes. All right, does that sound good, everyone? All right, so we're going to start reading the ballad out loud. Not because I have a general bias, but I think I'm imagining it going this side of the room first, so I guess counterclockwise. And so you can take, if you don't want to read, just say pass. No judgment from me. But I'm going to start by reading 1 to 2 stanzas, and then, if you feel really excited about the 2 stanzas you're reading, take the 2 stanzas. But otherwise, 1 is fine. Does everyone have a copy? Are we good to go? All right. Ready? Charlie had a herring-wearer down to Bailey's Bite. Got up to tend it in the middle of the night. Late October, midnight black as tar, nothing out the window but a big cold star.
House like a cemetery, kitchen fire dead. I'm damn good mad, said Charlie, to go back to bed. Damn good mind to go back to bed.
A man who runs a herring-wearer, even on the side, is nothing but a slave to the god-damned tide.
Well, a man feels meager, a man feels old, in pitch black midnight, lonesome and cold, chills in his stomach like 40,000 mice, and the very buttons on his pants, little lumps of ice.
Times he gets to feeling it's no damn use, so Charlie had a pitcher full in his orange juice. Then he felt better than he had before. So then he had another pitcher full to last him to the shore. I'll do one more. Down by the beach rocks underneath the tree, Charlie saw something he never thought he'd see.
Sparkling in the lantern light, as he went to pass, 3 big diamonds in the frosty grass. He said, diamonds, where they come from? I'll pick them up later on. Always wanted some.
Then he hauled in his dory. She felt light as air, and in the dark midnight rode off to tend where. Out by the ware gate, Charlie found an old sea serpent swimming round and round.
Head like a washtub, whiskers like thatch, breath like the flame on a Portland star match. Back in the lantern light, up he rose, a great big barnacle on the end of his nose.
Look, Charlie, over, surly and cross. Them fish you got shut up in there belongs to my boss. Fish, says Charlie. Fish in there? Well, I ain't caught a fish since I built the damn place.
Well, says the sea serpent, nevertheless, this 10,000 bushels, at a rough guess. Charlie moved the lantern, gave his oar a pull, and he saw that the ware was brim belly full.
Good thing he had a boy with a trillion at a time, and the sight of each and every one was like a silver dime.
Go ahead, Dan.
Well, says the sea serpent, what you going to do? They're uncomfortable and they don't belong to you. So open this contraption and let them go. Come on, shake the lead up. The boss says so.
Does, said Charlie. Who in hell is he thinks he can set back and send word to me? Sea serpent, swivel round, made a water spout. Keep on, brother, and you'll find out.
Why, Charlie says, you're nothing, but a lie so old you're hoary. So take your dirty whiskers off the gunnel of my dory. She's got a problem, I don't know what it is. Sea serpent twizzle, heaved underneath, scun back a set of sharp yellow teeth.
Came at Charlie with a gurgly roar, and Charlie let him have it with the port side oar. Right on the noggin, hell of a knock, and the old sea serpent sank like a rock.
So go on back, yells Charlie, and tell the old jerk not to send a boy to do a man's work.
Then over by the weregate, tinkly and clear, a pretty little voice says, "Yoo-hoo, Charlie dear."
Now what, says Charlie. This ain't funny. And the same sweet voice says, yoo-hoo, Charlie honey. And there on the same pole, right in the weir, was a little green mermaid combing out her hair.
All right, says Charlie, I see you. And I know who you come from, so you get two. He let fly the bailing scoop. It landed with a clunk. And when the water settled, the mermaid, she had sunk.
Then the ocean moved behind him with a mighty heave and a hiss, and a thundery, rumbling voice remarked, "I'm goddamn sick of this." An upcoming old man, white from top to toe, whiter than a daisy field, whiter than the snow.
Carrying a pitchfork with 3 tines on it, muttering in his whiskers, madder than a hornet. My sea serpent is so lame that he can hardly stir, and my best mermaid, you've raised a lump on her.
You've been pretty saucy calling me a jerk, so now the old man has come to do a man's work. Look, says Charlie, why don't you leave me be? You may be the hoary old man of the sea,
But I've got a run of fish here, shut up inside, and if you keep on friggin' round, you'll make me lose the tide. Then the next thing that Charlie knew, he was lying on the sand. The painter of his dory was right beside his hand.
You could see across the bay, calm and still and wide. It was full daylight, and it was high tide. Said Charlie, what am I about? The oars weren't wet, so we hadn't been out.
Oh, he thought. Diamonds. Underneath the tree. Seems to me I found some. I'd better go see. But when he couldn't find any, not one gem, only 3 little owl dungs with the frost on them.
Awesome job, everyone. That was great. All right, so does everyone feel solid about what just happened in that ballad? Do we need to go through it again, or do we think we're good? I think we're good. Okay. So I'm going to move on to my portion now, where I'm going to talk for about 20-25 minutes. So I have the best opener ever to this talk. What can a whiskery old sea serpent with a big barnacle on his nose, a little green mermaid, an old hoary man, whiter than snow, and frosted over owl dungs show us about a changing 20th century coastal Maine environment? Ruth Moore's 1958 ballad, "The Night Charlie Tended the Weir," and "Cold as a Dog in the Wind Northeast," is one of Ruth Moore's most recited and beloved pieces of work. Although Moore's ballad is satirical and incisive with its charming characters and beautiful imagery, it also points to a shift away from traditional small-scale fishing in 20th century coastal Maine. In the short ballad, we follow the story of a fisherman named Charlie and an unusual encounter he has when tending his herringware. Moore based this brief account of Charlie's experience on the lives of the fishermen around her on the coast of Bass Harbor, Maine, along with the memory of her childhood on Gotts Island. This regional ballad, with stunning rhymes and satirical jabs, points to Moore's exploration of the ideas of illusion and self-delusion that working-class coastal fishermen had to endure. The increasing difficulty of traditional ways of life to make a livelihood in a nuclear family structure, along with the constant ebb and flow of the persistent pull of the tide and environmental changes that were happening from increasing industrialization, made coastal island fishing towns microcosms for these larger 20th century American changes. Through a creative story that centers on a weir, Moore uses her protagonist to explore these larger economic, environmental, and personal changes, representing a larger sense of scarcity, precarity, and shift away from these traditional means of supporting families. Through Charlie's veiled hopes and illusions and his obsessive desire to somehow control the sea and forces of nature, Moore represents a man who is grasping for a livelihood that was being replaced in favor of an industrialized and globalized economy. The two most prominent images in Moore's ballad are the ware and the deceptive diamond. To start with, the ware, for many working men on the sea, was a trap they could set in addition to supplement other ways of making a living. Yet ware fishing was an increasingly precarious endeavor. Not only is the actual construct and goal of the ware inherently tedious, it is an obstruction made to trap fish, but completely dependent on the flow of water from the intertidal zone of the tide, but an increase in commercial fishing, along with canneries popping up along the coast, meant the ability to catch bushels was becoming increasingly difficult in the mid-20th century. Ware fishing was a generational endeavor, passed from generation to generation, father to son, as we can see from the Comey and Turner families in Moore's debut novel, The Ware. The finicky nature of the ware was undoubtedly a constant the family had to endure, and is echoed in how the ware is represented in this specific ballad. According to Moore's relatives, who heard tales of her childhood, sometimes her father's ware would catch a large school of herring, as is the case in the ballad, but other times the fragile construction and placement of the ware would be destroyed and require rebuilding. This constant feeling of frustration, uncertainty, precariousness, and lack of control was a dynamic that Moore observed from her father and wrote about in all of her writing concerning ware fishing and other small-scale fishing practices. In The Night Charlie Tended the Ware, Charlie attempts to catch fish with his ware, even though it rarely produces anything. The motivation surrounding Charlie's decision to utilize a ware, almost punishing himself by waking up in the middle of a frozen October night, not only represents an increasing desperate economic situation, but stubbornness and self-delusion. The stubbornness can be chalked up to the attitude a hard-working fisherman has to carry, while the self-delusion speaks to something bigger. The ware became a symbol for a myth of traditional prosperity. A man like Charlie should be able to make a living and support his family by using fishing methods that have been part of the local culture for generations. Charlie's inability to reckon with the changing ecological conditions that have resulted from changing fishing and distribution practices, therefore, not only hurts his financial prospects, but creates a cycle of failure and myth-making. By ignoring or rationalizing the negative effects of a changing economy and fishing industry, Charlie represents a man who is not ready to confront the increasing changes to mid-20th century life. The illusion that the ware will produce fish becomes almost as fictitious as the mythological characters of the sea serpent, mermaid, and Poseidon-like figure that make up the ballad. That's okay. When Charlie repeats over and over a fishing practice that can never function in a changing mid-20th century society, the lines between illusion and reality blur. Themes of illusion and delusion have a long-standing presence in some of the most important pieces of literature and are no doubt a legacy that Moore references. When Charlie dares to argue with the Poseidon-like figure, he is suddenly transported out of that reality. Quote, "The next thing that Charlie knew, he was lying on the sand. The painter of his story was right beside his hand. The oars weren't wet, so he hadn't been out." The sleeping and dreaming, reality and disillusion, represents a battle between innocence and guilt. Charlie's dream, or nightmare, can also be read as how his distorted consciousness affects his perception of reality. The fact that Charlie's fears and understanding of his reality weigh on his conscience so much that it causes him to hallucinate his endeavor on the water and create the imagined figments of the diamonds in front of him points to the fact that Charlie is at least somewhat aware of the increasing pressure around him. There are, in fact, specific moments in the text where Charlie thinks rationally and attempts to push past the illusion of the ware and the aura of its myth of its success. When he wakes up in the night to tend the ware to horrid conditions, he says to himself, quote, "Time he gets the feeling it's no damn use." Later, when the sea serpent confronts Charlie for his hoard of fish, he says, quote, "Fish, in there? Why you ain't caught a fish since I built the damn ware?" Beyond the clever wordplay, these moments of doubt from Charlie show he is not completely trapped in a mode of self-delusion. He knows his endeavor is likely to fail, but the fact that he continues to do it is perhaps where the real self-delusion lies. Perhaps waking up in the middle of the night and reassuring himself with pitcherfuls of orange juice is a way for Charlie to shock himself into coping with difficult emotions or maintain a sense of control in a chaotic, modernizing, and industrializing world. Either way, it is clear that Charlie knows the world is changing around him. He is just not quite sure how to grapple with it. The illusion of the diamond, which ends up being 3 little Alduns with frost on them, is another illustration of self-delusion as a tool to cope with the modernizing world. Just like the perplexity of believing the ware will bring success when it never has, to the reader or listener, in this case of the ballad, it is unimaginable and almost fantastical to think that owl feces could be mistaken for diamonds. When Charlie gets to the shore and notices the apparent diamonds on the ground, he says, quote, "Diamonds, where'd they come from?" In the same way that Charlie seems to be utterly surprised and confronted with the presence of the diamonds, the realities of a changing mid-20th century culture have snuck up on him as well. Rather than actually confronting this change, Charlie stays in a state of denial about the changing society around him. Charlie aptly says, "I'll pick them up later on. Always wanted some." The symbol of a diamond as a metaphor for this increasing financial opportunities industrialized fishing practices and fish canneries offered coastal inhabitants is clever. In an environment that first attracted white settlers because of the abundance of granite that would later support a booming granite industry in the 1800s, Charlie's forefathers were also concerned with the rocks and minerals on and in the ground. The delusion of the diamond represents an indication that a new industry and way of life were on the horizon. In the same way that early explorers spotted pink granite ripe for extraction, the false diamond represents a changing economy. In this case, one where Charlie is being left behind. As it turns out, the diamond is not actually a diamond. Similarly to how the sparkle and shine of the diamond blind Charlie's sense of reality and distort the nightmare of a changing world, the pull to the ware proves to be even more intoxicating. Why would a person ignore seeming diamonds at their feet to tend a trap that has never yielded fish? The answer is if the fish trap itself represents a more desirable reality than the diamonds ever could. Even though Charlie always wanted some, to pick up the diamonds instead of tending the ware would represent a compromise in his life's ethos. To choose the easy way to make it rich would go against everything Charlie believes, as represented by his persistence on the water. Not only then is the increasing world around him a new modern one, but one that rejects the hardworking traditions Charlie feels are innate to his humanness and his identity as a working-class coastal fisherman. Though there is no definitive time period in which this specific story takes place, this collection of ballads was first published in 1958, and Moore's other ware-centered text, The Ware, was written in 1943, although it takes place in a pre-World War II fishing village. This ballad might therefore be an amalgamation of an environment ranging from Moore's childhood on Goss Island from 1903 to 1917, where she witnessed her father's fishing endeavors, to 1958, when it was ultimately published. These 5 decades, some of the busiest in American history, with 2 world wars, a Great Depression, and increasing modernization and industrialization, means it's difficult to pin down exactly what larger changes Moore was specifically examining in her ballad. Though the evolution in fishing practices over the decades Moore was witnessing around her and the ways the country was changing economically and politically in the mid-20th century no doubt had a large impact on Charlie's sentiments and conditions of this ballad. Perhaps one of the principal ways to pin down exactly what Moore was confronting is actually to look at the symbol of the Poseidon-like figure in the ballad. who represents both an economic and political boss. The hoary old man of the sea undoubtedly personifies the power of the tide. Yet he also, in his role as a sea serpent and mermaid's boss, represents a patriarchal figurehead that rules the environment. Charlie's quick dismissal of not only the existence of the Poseidon-like figure, but of his rule of law represents a stubborn attitude that rejects political hierarchy and force. Quote, "Why don't you leave me be? You may be the old hoary man of the sea, but I've got to run a fish here, shut up inside, and if you keep on friggin' around, you'll make me lose the tide." In the same way that the illusion of the diamond suggests a change on the horizon, the arrival of the Poseidon-like figure links Charlie's ritualistic wear-checking with a new authoritative force. Charlie not only dismisses the boss, but is completely dismayed by the fact that there could be a governing force on the water influencing his normal and generationally inherited practices. Though shifting fishing practices truly began to take effect at the beginning of the 20th century, the effects of these changes and the working class fishermen left behind in their wake followed decades later. Practices were shifting in huge ways. Lobster boats were no longer sailboats, but engine powered. Developments in cold storage made fishermen focus on haddock instead of cod. Industrial fishing fleets were replacing traditional schooner rigs, and steam-powered trawlers were starting to take bushels and bushels of fish out of the water all at once. In fact, it wasn't until 1953 when the first regulations specifying the minimum mesh size for trawl nets started to come into force. The World Wars meant the demand for fish was extremely inconsistent. While profitability in fishing declined through the Great Depression, it rebounded during World War II as protein demands increased again. Yet after the war, there was inevitably a lower demand, and this led not only to precarity and gaps in the market, but also an unregulated and inconsistent fishing practices. This only increased the level of competition for industrial fishermen. Adding to that pressure, as part of the Marshall Plan following World War II, Eisenhower transferred American fishing technologies and opened American markets to European allies in order to bolster resistance to the Soviet Union. These policies lowered pre-war tariffs on imported frozen fish fillets, making former allies into adversaries against whom New England fishermen had to compete. Starting at the end of the 19th century, fishing in coastal environments became less of a tradition that the local farmers and fishermen of the region could partake in to support their families, and more of a practice that attracted inland, poor, or foreign migrants. These foreign workers are represented in some of Moore's writing, most notably in the character of Joe Sanger, a Portuguese immigrant in Moore's novel Spoonhandle. Class divisions in the coastal communities became more pronounced as well. An indication in the text that points to Moore's concern with the role fishermen had with their catches and unregulated overfishing that was happening during this tumultuous historical period is when the sea serpent points to the uncomfortability of the fish Charlie catches in his ware. "Well," says the sea serpent, "what you gonna do? They're uncomfortable and they don't belong to you." Besides the interesting implied hierarchy that this suggests, is a sea serpent a creature who can speak and advocate for fish who are mere victims? Including the point of view of the herring is an intentional addition. In using an environmental humanities approach, it is arguable that Moore was interested in giving autonomy and a voice to sea creatures. When the sea serpent speaks and uses his voice to point out the herring's conditions, the perspective of fishing flips from fishermen to catch. Though we as readers or listeners empathize deeply with Charlie and undoubtedly root for his success, when confronted with the fact that a ware aims to trap a vast quantity of fish, we are forced to reckon with the harm it can bring to the larger ecosystem. Moore's choice to represent the perspective of the herrings, therefore, points to the forces of nature as worthy subjects capable of having control of their own narrative in this larger conversation about 20th century fishing practices. The sea serpent's concern is valid. Over the 20th century, due to industrial fishing, the Atlantic halibut, ocean perch, haddock, and yellowtail flounder, which once fed millions of Americans, were coming close to commercial extinction. The increase in overfishing and industrial practices became what you could say a vicious cycle. As Matthew Mackenzie writes, quote, ecological strain induced industrial strain. Individual fishermen like Charlie, who were not fishing on an industrial level, had to be aware of their own practices, as well as those of the larger industry around them. Not only was the fishing industry competing with Charlie's traditional fishing practices, but they were literally stripping the water of its resources. Charlie's angst towards the changing fishing industry and his lack of concern for the bushel of fish in his ware makes more sense in this larger dynamic. When the sea serpent points out the fish that don't belong to Charlie, he calls into question larger notions of both propriety and property. The landscape around Charlie, even beyond the water, was vastly changing in the mid-century as well. John Gillis, in his work on the Blue Humanities, points to the idea of the sea being continentalized, which is the tendency for land to incorporate sea and treat it as territory. This term can be traced back to the 1890s, when officials were using this logic to describe near-shore islands. The term continental shelf came into use in the 1950s at the time of Charlie's endeavors in this ballad, and led states to claim economic resources like offshore oil and gas as their own. In a state with a vast political history of prioritizing the rights of individuals and their private property, the political landscape of Maine was starting to shift. In the early 20th century, the state courts were finally willing to allow the exercise of eminent domain if the general public were allowed to use the condemned property. To this day, actually getting to the shoreline in Maine can be difficult, since only about 12% of the state's 5,400 miles of mainland and island shoreline is considered public ownership, even though fishing, fouling, or navigation are all rights the court usually rules in favor of. The commodification of shoreline property was a concern Moore not only observed around her, but was warned about as a child. Her grandfather warned against islanders selling their properties, saying, quote, if you sell your land for money, what do you have when you've spent the money? Nothing.
Yeah.
The concept of land and ownership in Moore's grandfather's quote represents the larger attitudes around ownership and the right to natural resources of the time. Setting the stage for Moore's concerns, the 19th century proved to be the starting point where industrial practices were favored over small fisheries and local workers. Rail connections meant made part of the fishing industry by the development of cold storage, and it only went to a few large ports instead of small coastal harbors like the one in which Charlie was most likely fishing. For the majority of the 19th century, the coast of Maine was defined by its seaports and working waterfronts, home of fishermen like Charlie. Yet, a century later, in the 1950s, container ships were starting to take over, and these old fishing ports were beginning to close down. In fact, by the 1960s, most of these former working areas were being transformed into residential and recreational areas. The development of gas engines removed the considerable advantage of living close to fishing grounds and ideal wear locations. In the uncertainty of land rights and the ability for the government to seize land from individuals in a region that has a long history of don't tread on me attitudes, one can imagine why it was so shocking and disorienting for the sea serpent to question Charlie's ownership of the fish. In doing so, he is pointing to a larger cultural debate that Charlie was likewise being confronted with in the mid-century. White settler communities first came to the region, now known as Maine, for good fishing and farming in the 1600s. Continuous conflicts with the indigenous groups, the Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot, which together are known as the Wabanaki or people of the Dawnland, was increasingly becoming an issue for local governments. The Wabanaki were the first people living in the current state of Maine when white settlers began to violently dispossess them. Local officials started to give out tax exemptions for 5 years to white folks who resettled in their new and safer settlements to avoid conflict. Additional incentives included 100 acres of land if a house was built and occupied for 3 years, a sawmill to aid in house construction, a vessel to transport, a ministry, a school, and tools for building. This heritage of an implied ownership and access to land is directly confronted by the sea serpent, who blatantly states they don't belong to you. This legacy of entitlement, which is disrupted by a non-human figure, is a prime example of Charlie's willingness to argue with forces of nature, no matter how illogical. The origin of the ware as a fishing practice itself represents the history of entitlement for some fishermen of the region. Historically, besides using nets, hooks, and lines, Wabanaki people of the region made wares out of wooden stakes placed in shallow streams and small tidal bays. In fact, a narrow sea passage between Little Deer and Big Deer Isle, which is approximately 15 miles away from Bass Harbor, was even known as the Great Fish Ware. The history of the settlement of Maine explains the complex and deeply rooted sense of ownership and legacy of entitlement that fishermen like Charlie had over the natural world and even the tools of their labor, the nuances of which Moore was interested in exploring in her writing. The Night Charlie Tended the Ware is a ballad that follows a 20th century small-scale fisherman with beautiful rhymes and undeniable satire. It brings mythological figures, illusions, and desperation together into a story that is both hilarious and tragic. Charlie is an anti-hero whom the reader can't help but empathize with deeply. But Moore also creates additional characters, not only in Charlie and the mythological figures, but in her depiction and humanization of the sea. Through the character of Charlie, she critiques the power structures of anthropocentrism and the increasing industrial fishing industry practices that were destroying the environment. While Charlie is flawed in his sense of entitlement towards the environment, he is also a victim of changing times that were abandoning traditional fishing practices in favor of industrial production that could produce commodities on a global scale. Moore's unique position as a woman writer allows her to use the environmental humanities to represent a local way of life, but also to critique structures of oppression. The ballad makes it clear that the same power structures that lead to Charlie's failed fishing endeavor exclude others from the water. The larger genre of regionalism in which Moore wrote allowed her to represent her local culture, but also explored themes and issues that were affecting Americans across the nation. Though most of us will not wake up at the crack of dawn to tend a ware, our position as both exploiters and exploited, stuck in dreams and nightmares, insiders and outsiders, is a universal dilemma that Moore hoped to represent. A changing 20th century society no doubt mirrors the aggressive changes of our country right now, a time where we can only hope to be able to dream of finding diamonds, but in actuality are mostly confronted with realities more similar to 3 little Aldons with frost on them. Thank you. All right, everyone. So we're going to move on to, I was advised to first ask, before we move on to specific discussion questions, if there are any other questions that, maybe personal questions that anyone wants to go over first. And then I'm thinking about going over some of those discussion questions. Does that sound good? Yes.
So there was one, I thought, misreading here,
Please.
and it reflects on Charlie's character.
Yeah.
Times he gets the feeling it's no damn use.
Yeah.
So Charlie had a pitcher full of his orange juice, is what you said.
Yeah.
But he had a pitcher full in his orange juice, which
I
is
see.
up to me, alcohol.
So I've missed this completely. I fully admit this is helpful. So I use the word shock to describe the experience of the orange juice, and maybe that still works with the shot of alcohol in it. But that's certainly interesting, and I think maybe speaks even more to this sort of numbing, inability to confront what's really around him, the changes that are happening around him.
I just don't want you to ruin his reputation.
Thank you, I appreciate that. That is very helpful. And that is not noted in my larger research papers. That's very helpful. Thank you. Yes, Jackie.
And you know, that's kind of a common theme, like some of the old stories, you know, do involve alcohol. And,
Yeah.
you know, there's several, I'm sure in every state, local culture, but in Maine there's a lot of, you know, hilarious but tragic drinking stories. But I think, you know, I've heard it said that it really doesn't matter whether you're altered by a substance or not, what's in there is in there. You know, what's you're conflicted about is there anyway, and the alcohol just exacerbates it.
Yeah.
So.
Definitely.
So it doesn't, to me, it doesn't nullify any of your themes, but but I had always read it as that he, you know,
Yeah.
he like
I
braced
can't
himself.
believe I missed that. Obviously, I haven't lived a good life of being a fisherman. It just went right past me. I would have taken the orange juice and drank it right down without thinking twice about it.
I think you have different words that you use in New Jersey, that's all.
Of course, it's a regional thing. Any other like little, again, unrelated questions before we sort of?
Just a little tiny thing.
Go ahead.
Is that the pellets are not dungs probably, but regurgitated bones and fur.
I see.
Yeah.
So they're not shit.
Still,
Correct.
not shit, but
Yeah.
vomit.
Which is better.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really helpful. Owl dung, not poop. Okay.
Yeah, it is poop.
It's
their ways of-
regurgitated.
Is it-
Owls eat mice and stuff, and then they regurgitate the bones and what they can't digest.
Yeah.
And they're little pellets.
Because, you know, my reading and my professor's reading was always like feces as diamonds, but now it's regurgitation as diamonds, which is perhaps an even more nuanced understanding of these sparkly diamonds. So that's great.
Oh, well, maybe, yeah.
He does call them.
He does call them owl dungs. So
That's
maybe
the
it's
dungs was
dropping,
where I got it from.
yeah.
But it's interesting to think of them.
Yeah.
As
Yeah.
it's either way. It's interesting to think of those fake diamonds as regurgitation too.
Just to continue this really charming theme that we're talking about, lots of kids in early science class will dissect dung to see what the owl has been eating.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a science nature project, which is kids love.
Yeah.
It's like finding diamonds.
I was gonna say it's their version of diamonds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
Lovely. Okay, so I don't have a sheet of the discussion questions in front of me, but I wrote them. So, can I have that? Even though I wrote them, I'm a little bit. Thank you so much.
Can I say one thing?
Oh, go ahead, John. Go ahead.
There's something in your talking somewhere about the fact that he actually the oars were not wet, so he never went out to the water at all. He was dreaming on the shore because he drank so much before he ever got there.
Yeah.
And then all the rest of the imagery was in his dream.
Yes, he completely hallucinated everything. Yeah. Apologies if I didn't make that clear.
Well, you probably did, and
I went through it fast. All right, so, you know, I wanted to make sure, again, I'm from New Jersey, I'm 24 years old, so I wasn't even born in I was born in 2001, so I haven't lived any of this, and, you know, I do my best at trying to understand, but I wanted to, you know, and I'm writing everything down because this is helpful for my research, but I wanted to, you know, my first question is, what memories does this ballad inspire in you? You know, Lisa, go ahead.
So this isn't necessarily, no, it's kind of a memory. I grew up, my great-grandmother and my grandparents had a house on God's Island. So I grew up from a very young age going out there. And in the cabin at our house is a photograph of some folks standing on Little Gots. It's a black and white photo, and there's a herring looking out at Great God Island, and they can see the poles of the weir sticking out. And every time I read this poem, which I've read many times, I just visualize him on God's Island going out to that weir, and I just contrast it to now. I mean, I've never seen a weir there. I mean, I was born in 1969, and I'm sure it was long gone before I came out there. And so I just think about what life was like in, like how you could, at one point, you could abundantly make a living up there, even though it was tough. But then it became scraping, making a living by, to the point where people couldn't live out there anymore for a variety of different reasons. And I always think about that when I read this. Just people going down there to make a living, and how tough that must have been.
Remember that wasn't his only job. He was the
Yeah.
postmaster, and he ran a general store.
Yeah, it says in the ballot even on the side, so it
Yeah.
seems like
Yeah.
Moore is referring to like that being, you know, one of multiple things that a man does to support his family.
And it just
It's
reminds
so
me of like the waning days of
Yeah.
being able to live on an offshore island and
Mm.
support yourself.
Any other memories?
So I remember just seeing them everywhere up and down the coast, you know. I can't specifically tell you where, but I just, you know, remember that beautiful silhouette of the,
Yeah.
you know, they're silhouetted in black at a certain time of day, you know. And, yeah, so many villages had them.
You're talking about prayers, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and like, I can't tell you,
Yeah, like sea doilies.
well,
These things
very well put.
They're
They're like
they're
really-
woven, they're woven and you see them
Yeah.
sitting up there.
They're beautiful. I mean, you know, but I can't tell you when I stopped seeing them. You know, it's that kind of thing where when things kind of gradually slip away, you don't realize the end.
I think you can see them still in some places down east.
Probably.
Non-functional.
Yeah.
Would it have been in
right.
the pool area, those weirs? In the pool area?
Yeah.
No. It would be the
Like
narrow
going
channel
into the
between those
yeah,
two islands. That's
Yeah.
why it was
because
so
it was
good.
like funneling from my understanding
Yeah.
into shallower areas.
And the tide funnels through there and
Mhm.
was fairly powerful.
Is what they're doing catching the elvers in Soamesville? Are those miniature
Just thinking
weirds?
of that.
Yeah.
I'm not the person to ask.
It's
Does anyone
like
else
a
in the room
modern
know?
day version,
Yeah,
right?
that's it
And-
seems like they're little nets and
Yeah,
Yeah.
basically it is the same idea. And, you know, I remember that too in that would have been like late 90s. I had never heard of them, and this place that I worked, this woman came in and she goes, you know, oh my God, there's these things called glass eels and you can make thousands of dollars, and it was like new and unregulated.
Yeah.
And she did. You had to be really aware of the tide, and it was the same thing. You'd go out, maybe the tide was the right spot at 3 a.m., you know, and she'd come into work and she goes, oh yeah, we were getting glass eels last night, I'm exhausted. But she made all kinds of money until it got regulated,
Yeah.
which it needed to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it was a free-for-all there, and I remember she brought some in a jar, and I'm like, those?
Yeah.
You know, but they grow them,
Yeah.
right? They
Mhm.
catch them in that size, and then they grow them bigger in other facilities.
Yeah.
Again, commercial, industrial, I think they grow them in Japan mostly.
Yeah.
Yes, I've heard of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they
Yeah.
just send the little ones from here to Japan and
Yeah.
then grow them big.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, but for a while there was, you know, when it was like this, it was like the gold rush.
Yeah.
It reminded me of the gold rush. You know, it was like a free-for-all, and then very quickly it started getting regulated.
Yeah.
And then there were like the Elvers Wars, you know, where like
and they were tough.
people would like
People were doing it.
bring their
Gun
guns.
play.
Yeah, they'd bring their guns to sell
Good
them.
fishermen too.
Yeah.
And there was great animosity towards the Wabanaki, who got to have, they could go on their land
Yeah.
and they didn't have to have a license, and there was a lot of
Yeah.
animosity towards that too.
They
I
also
think it was on
served
the
the
front
little,
page of the New York
served the
Yeah.
little glass eels
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
in Japan, because I was at a conference there and the breakfast buffet had a big bowl.
And you were like, they're right from my backyard.
Oh
Yeah,
my
little
God, that's
glass
wild.
eels that are between a half inch and an inch
Okay.
long, and they literally look like glass.
Okay.
So they were eating the small ones?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. I
Absolutely.
thought they
think
just
use
grew
them
them.
in sashimi and
Yeah.
sushi.
There's a book written by a former professor at COA that I'm forgetting the name of it, but I will look into it. That speaks about that industry.
Oh wow.
So that's a more recent memory. I still wasn't born in the 90s though, so I wouldn't have been there for it. Does anyone have any other? Let's go down these discussion questions. Has anyone noticed any environmental shifts that occurred in the 20th century? But again, we can talk about now too. It doesn't have to be when this ballad was written. So we talked about the eels. We talked about not seeing ware traps as much anymore. I was snorkeling the other day and I see those little invasive green crabs all the time.
Yeah.
But obviously that's not necessarily a small scale, but like any sort of micro example of some of the environmental changes that have been happening. But I'm only here for like once a month in the summer, so obviously people who live here full time have maybe noticed bigger
I grew
things.
up here summer times and Northeast Harbor, and right across from the family had a pier, a dock that overlooked Bear Island. And as kids, we used to go down with our hand lines and we'd pull up, flounder, bigger than dinner plates, and pollock, and sometimes bluefish, but mostly and sculpins. but then as a older adolescent, they disappeared, and that would have been in the like 60s.
Yeah. And do you think it's because of the industrial fishing
I
that was
think
happening,
they
or like the side effects of it, right?
And the draggers would come in and
Yeah.
they mess up the bottom.
Yep.
And so they're
Because it's not just
responding.
about like the fish getting taken out; it's about their environment being destroyed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then
It's also because we dumped our sewage into the harbor.
That's
Yeah.
true too.
We
Our
used to
family
catch
did that.
flies off Thurston's Wharf and all those, and mussels we used to catch. We used to put
Yeah.
up in front of our house.
Yeah.
I don't think there are any that, even now, there are mussels, maybe
Yeah.
a few,
Yeah.
nothing like we caught as kids.
We used to fish for flounder in Bass Harbor as kids
Yeah.
in the 40s and early 50s.
Yeah.
They're gone now.
And
Yeah.
this is
The other thing is,
go on.
as more people moved here from away, as summer people moved in, more of the working waterfront became privately owned.
Yep.
And so that affected the fishing industry too.
totally,
in addition to the mussels being gone, is this influx of oysters.
Yeah.
That's an environmental because the Gulf of Maine is warming, but also we have oyster farms.
Yeah.
And that spawn is being released. And I was somewhere recently, and I was just walking by. It was in Town Hill, Pre-Marsh area, and there were oysters just right there.
Yeah.
And this is something separate. I have a friend who, talking about tradition, he's a bloodworm digger, and his whole generations were bloodworm diggers up in Hog Bay, and talking about access in the clam diggers, and then now this the seaweed industry. There's a lot of politics on access to the low tide area.
Yeah.
And it's with the park and with private owners, and that's a big issue.
Yeah.
That's going on right now. Not to mention that you can't even gather clams in so many places and so much of the year because of
The water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
pollution. Yeah.
And that makes me think, just looking at question 3, how did that change? We talked a little bit about Moore's father working on the ware on the side. How does that change, these environmental changes, the livelihoods of fishermen now? Are they having to create farms? Or are people coming from away? I'm just wondering if there are any thoughts or reflections on how the shift from, again, small scale fishing to industrial scale fishing changed the economic lives of people on the island.
Yeah, so to meet worldwide demand, farming in theory sounds wonderful, doesn't it?
Yes.
Oh, we can
Yeah.
grow all the fish we need.
Yep.
In theory it's great, but they haven't worked out enough of the kinks, and that's super controversial and a big polluter. Sounds wonderful. I wish they could figure out a way to do it really cleanly, because everyone wants their fish, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And I just want to quickly run back to the green crab and mussels. Where I lived, the cove was, you know, mussels all the way across. It's low tide as far as you could see. There were some that were always submerged that we'd just go get dinner, you know, and there's not one left.
Yeah.
Zero.
That happened
And
in Pretty Marsh too.
I know that's the
Happened in
green
Grass
crab.
Harbor.
Yeah.
Grass Harbor too.
Yeah.
There's probably other places where it's, you know, other kinds of pollution or whatever, but
It's pretty much solely,
Go ahead.
solely lobstering in Bass Harbor, right? I mean,
Pretty much.
Yeah.
and they're able to live on that.
And even
There-
that is not as prolific
No.
as it
No.
used to.
Oh, okay.
And those fishermen live in
Yeah,
Town Hill and Ellsworth.
Yep.
They
Yeah.
don't live on the island.
they can't afford it.
Very
Yeah,
few
they
of them.
don't have
That's
access.
something always sticks out to me when I read Ruth Moore is that everyone is always looking outside their house to see the weather and to see
Yeah.
the
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that disconnection.
and you can't
Yeah.
you can't read Ruth Moore. I mean, I can't
Yeah.
anyway without thinking, yeah, but they're not there anymore.
Yeah. There used to be a really big Maine shrimp
Yes.
yes.
Oh yeah, yeah.
industry,
It's awesome.
and that's been closed.
Yeah.
for-
But you know, that came in during, I mean, when we were growing up in the 40s, nobody fished for shrimp.
Yeah,
And then the water must have gotten colder because they're like Norwegian,
Right.
Scandinavian, the colder, the little shrimp are small.
and now they're not.
And now they're not
here
catching.
anymore.
So it was a cycle.
Yeah.
kind of.
I didn't know that.
And then I just want to pop this question in, a little unrelated to what we've been talking about. But again, she's a woman writing about a predominantly male industry. And I've written about and spoken about in other contexts how she has this unique perspective, I think, of being disallowed from the water, but being around so many family members. You know, she had her dory, skiff.
One of
She
us.
is. I knew I messed it up as soon as that. She had her skiff, which is displayed outside. And you know, I always think that her perspective, again, being a woman, is really unique. And I think, you know, a lot of her protagonists are male, but I think, you know, she was obviously able to observe, listen, to hear their stories and represent them really well. And I can tell Muriel wants to say something, so go ahead.
Even though she wrote about strong men and
Yeah.
all that, there's a strong woman in every single one of them.
Yes.
Totally.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
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 It's not really related to the fishing
No.
question, but it's worth saying.
No, but I am, and so I'm just interested by, you know, her gender, her perspective, of this on the water, and obviously, you know, it seems that in some way industry brings progress, and you know, maybe women were hired to be on the water more, but you know, in other ways, as we just talked about, industry hurt the environment. Yeah. Any thoughts?
And I also want to say, this is a little bit of a side, but
Yeah.
when you're talking about her unique perspective
Yeah.
in your tobacco article,
Yeah.
you talk about her unique perspective as an insider
Yeah.
and an outsider.
Yeah.
So she had that, she grew up with this. This was her life, but she went away and learned that this isn't the way it is everywhere.
And as I wrote about in my larger article, which I couldn't share all the way here, you know, she worked for the NAACP, and
Yeah.
she was very much learning how to represent, you know, the voiceless. And
Yeah.
that was something that I think by giving, again, not only the sea creatures, which are imagined, granted, but, you know, the water a voice, I think that was something that in which she was interested in representing completely.
Have you seen the book? There's more than one book on this topic, but the one that sticks out to me is a book called Pretty Rugged.
Mm-mm.
It's about it's probably right here.
Yeah.
It's a lot of photographs. It's about women. Lots.
I think I actually
lots
have.
Of women. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's relatively
Yeah.
new.
Yeah.
And you know, I always just kind of assumed that sort of went with the whole progression of
Yeah.
women in non-traditional roles.
Yep.
You know, and it was just sort of an inevitability or whatever. But
So, and just really quickly, a niche in some of my research, I found that actually in these smaller scale fishing settings, sometimes women would be involved, right? So, like, if you need help and your daughter's the only one around, then you're gonna ask your daughter.
Yeah.
So, in some ways, that actually provided access.
Yeah.
And then when industry came and things changed, then it sort of went back on its head. I don't know if that's what you were gonna maybe reference.
about that same
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
It has to do with the fact that Mainers still today have lots of jobs. You know,
Yeah.
one
Yes.
person
Yeah.
has at different times a year does different
Yeah.
things, and that still happens. And I think it also happens because just what you know was just discussed. If
Right.
there's no, if you don't have any sons around, you get your wife to do it, or you get your daughter to do it.
Yeah.
And usually, from maybe it's because I read too many books, but too often the you know daughter is like, I want to go do what my brothers are doing. You know, so I think that the crossover happens because so many jobs are needed to be filled at certain times,
Yes.
and then those are gone,
Yeah.
and then they come back the next year.
Totally.
Well, and with industrialization,
Yeah.
I mean, the sardine factories
Yep.
were filled with women.
Predominantly women.
And
yeah.
That's true.
crab pickers
Yep.
are predominantly women.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I would love to talk more about, and again, it's in my larger paper, but I didn't have time today. I want to respect everyone's time. Any concluding, Muriel, go ahead. No, okay. Any concluding, go ahead, Emmy.
I want to say about the Maine accent, that word W-E-I-R
Yes.
almost has 2 syllables. It's not where,
Yeah.
it's where.
I can't do it. I can do coffee, but I can't do where.
We are.
I can't do it. I'm gonna always
Yeah,
butcher it.
It's southern, very southern.
Maybe in 10 years I'll get it.
Just having
yeah.
fun.
I think I always said.
Yes, go ahead.
What's your favorite
Where
Ruth Moore
would
book?
we?
Oh, you know, people ask me this a lot. You know which one is underrated is the fire balloon. I feel like
Yeah.
that's a real like inspiring story. You know, the Where is the first one I read, so probably would say that. Or Speak to the Winds is also good because of God's Island. So one of those 3. But honestly, like I started with her novels before I did ballads. I'm like, you know, my bachelor's is in English, and I study a lot of novels, so that was what I started with. And you can't go wrong with any of them.
I like Sarah Walked Over the Mountain. It is not as detailed, it doesn't have as much language, and you can't buy it anywhere anymore. But that woman was strong.
Yeah.
She escaped a husband who threw her and 7 or 8 kids out in the winter. She came from PEI, Muriel,
Cape
Canada.
Breton Island
And they walked
in Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
and wound up on Swans Island.
It's
She
a
was
good
a
book.
real, it was a real
literally
person who did that.
Yeah.
What was the name of the book?
Sarah Walked Over the Mountain.
That actually happened in Ruth's ancestry.
Yeah.
Ancestry.
And Sarah is buried on Swans Island, Maine.
Her name wasn't Sarah, but she was
No.
there.
Yeah.
So you're gonna mention the calendar at the end?
Oh, so as I mentioned earlier, I'm a member of the Tremont Historical Society, and we, with the help of all of us, have created a 2026 calendar that is Ruth Moore themed. So essentially what we've done is we do a historical photo, 1 to 2 photos on every month that we think relates to one of her books. So, I mean, The Where is an easy one. We put a picture of Ruth's father tending the Where. But like we have, you know, we linked Art and Ann Kellum and The Dinosaur Bite, and you know we have The Fire Balloon and Spoon Handle and all of the good classics paired together with historical photos. And we are taking pre-sale orders now. The Historical Society will be getting the calendar. We'll be getting the physical copies in about 10 days, but we're taking pre-sale orders now, and they are a great present for loved ones on birthdays, holidays, whatever you can imagine. And Muriel will be sitting in the back room taking pre-orders if anyone would like. And that concludes my presentation today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ellen. There's some wine. I'm going to throw some cheese and crackers back there if you want to stick around. And pre-order calendar.
I can eat